Okay, our last speaker is Dr. Chetan Gohil. He's currently a postdoc research fellow at the University of Oxford, where he works in the analysis group of the Oxford Center for Human Brain Activity, which is Mark Woolrich's group. And so he's going to be talking to us about MEG data, a little bit of deep learning, maybe a little bit of fMRI as a kicker at the end. I don't know. We'll see. Oh, darn it. Okay. Well, look forward to your talk. So I'll let you take it away from here.
Actually, yeah, there will. Okay, so
okay, there you go. Put it in for me. Thanks. No.
So this is going to be quite an educational talk. I'll be talking about how you'd infer dynamic networks in functional neuroimaging data. I will focus on source localized MEG data, but everything is equally applicable to fMRI data. And how do I switch? This.
The green one is going forwards.
All right, excellent. And then, okay.
This one is going back, I think. Oh, no, that's for the...
Okay, it's fine. All right. Yep, so I will be talking about different methods for inferring dynamic networks, and this will be quite a friendly introduction to a lot of these methods. So no differential equations with nonlinearities or anything like that. Very educational. So I want to start by talking about brain networks. And there's this idea that what's important for cognition is the interaction between different brain regions. And a useful model to capture this aspect is to calculate a network from your functional imaging data. And it has been shown that there are reproducible networks at rest. Some of these have been associated to task, and these networks can be impaired by different diseases, as we saw in the first talk. So how does one calculate a network from imaging data? So a typical approach is you define some nodes, which are regions of interest, and these could be parcels or voxels or whatever level you want. And then you calculate a metric for connectivity between these nodes, and these are edges in your network. And what's typically done is you take your entire time series and you calculate a time average network. And a consequence of this is if the brain is dynamically transitioning between different networks, you'll see the time average of this. So you wouldn't be sensitive to this precise dynamic network description. Cognition occurs at quite fast timescales. So ideally, what we're after are methods that can infer fast dynamic networks. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So the first thing you can do, or the simplest thing, and probably the most common, is to take your time series and just look at a small segment of your data and calculate whatever you would have done, whichever metric, just using that small window. And then you have a trade-off between the size of the window, which would improve the accuracy of your network estimation, and the temporal precision of your sliding window. So when you calculate sliding window connectivity, you end up with a time series of network matrices, where the off-diagonal elements are the connections between your regions, and the diagonal is the activity at each region. What's typical is you would cluster these network matrices to get a very compact representation of your data as recurring networks. So a limitation of a sliding window is you have no idea what the underlying dynamics or the temporal scales of the dynamics are. The sliding window does have the benefit that you could calculate any metric you want from the direct data. So a popular alternative that can help with finding the dynamics directly from the data is to take a generative modeling approach, and I'll talk about the Hidden Markov Model here. So first, I'll talk about how you generate data. So you formulate a model for generating data, and then you perform inference, which I'll talk about after this. So here, you hypothesize that underlying your observed data, there is this hidden state. And this state dynamically transitions from time to time. And the transitions are characterized by a matrix, where each row indicates the probability of either remaining in a state or transitioning to a different state. So from this matrix, you could sample a time series which indicates which state you're in currently. And then you combine that with an observation model. And in this talk, I'll only consider a multivariate normal, where each state has its own unique multivariate normal distribution. And so the covariance of this distribution is my representation of a network. The off-diagonal elements are the connectivity, and the diagonal elements are the activity. And when a state is active, you use that state's covariance matrix to generate your time series data. So what you do, or what this model does, is it models repeated covariance structures in your time series, which can dynamically change depending on the state. Okay, so that's all well and good, but what you have is the inverse problem where you have the observed data, and what you want to do is infer what the most likely hidden states are. And there are well-known algorithms of Bayesian, variational Bayesian inference to give you this. And the key point I want to mention is you learn both the dynamics of when each state is active and the network structure of each state directly from the data. So this is completely unsupervised. It tells you when a state is active and what the covariance structure at that state is. So I highlight one particular state which reoccurs, and just to hammer home, this is a network structure. You can plot the spatial map of activity, which is the diagonal, as a spatial map, and the off-diagonal as a graphical network. So once you have this latent description of the dynamics as a state, so each color represents a state and the width is the probability, you can calculate summary metrics of dynamics such as the average duration a state is active and the switching rate, total time spent in a state, and this gives you a useful tool or summary features of dynamics which you could then use for downstream tasks such as comparing individuals or characterizing individuals, comparing healthy versus disease or whatever you're interested in. So these are dynamic features which could be biomarkers for certain things. And then just to focusing on the average lifetime of these states, in MEG we find very fast networks on the order of 50 milliseconds. So what happens when you apply this model to a large cohort of healthy people? So this is the CAMCAN MEG dataset, around 600 healthy people. What I'm showing here is a 10-state HMM, and I'm showing the power relative to the time average. So what this indicates is when state 2, for example, is activated, you have more sensory motor activity. These states have unique oscillatory properties. So with MEG, you have high temporal resolution. So you could calculate the power spectra when a particular state is active. And you see that in MEG data, the brain transitions between different oscillatory spatial patterns and oscillatory frequencies. And these networks also have unique phase locking patterns in their network connectivity. And one final comment is, so this model has been applied to a variety of MEG data sets, and we can quite robustly find the same set of networks in REST, in task, using differing numbers of states and with different pre-processing. Okay, so that's great. So the HMM was originally developed in the 1960s. It's very old. It's a very old-school statistical model. There's been a lot of recent advances in the field of deep learning. So can we you take any of these advancements and improve our ability to infer dynamic networks? So I'll start by revisiting the HMM, and I'm going to highlight two key limitations. So the first one is this transition probability matrix. The next state only depends on the state you're in now, which is a very limited memory, or your ability to model dynamics is very limited. Also, it's an assumption of this model that only one state can be active at a given time point, and this could be quite a naive assumption for brain data. So how can a new model challenge these limitations? So this model is called dynamic network modes. And what you do is you model the data as a linear mixture of modes, while the mixing equation is on the bottom. So this instantaneous covariance CT is a linear sum of these mode covariances. And the mixing coefficients are positive and sum to 1. I refer to these now as modes to indicate a temporal overlap, whereas a state would be one entity at a given time point. And then we can also use more modern deep learning architectures to model the forecasting of these mixing coefficients, and we use LSTM, which is a form of recurrent neural network. And this has been shown to be able to model long-range structure in time series data. I'll just briefly like to comment on another popular model as modes, which is ICA. So ICA is conceptually DyNeMo and ICA are quite similar, except for ICA models the data as spatial maps, whereas DyNeMo is a proper graphical network, i.e. models the dynamics and the connections, and is also a explicit model of the dynamics within the data. Okay, so we have our model. We would like to fit this to our observed data. How do we do this? So first, we take our observed data and we feed it to an inference network. In our case, we typically use a bidirectional LSTM stacked. And then this predicts the mixing coefficients. And separate to that, you learn the network structure for each covariance, and then you add them up to give you the instantaneous covariance. You start off with random values for the inference network and the networks, and then you iteratively update these parameter estimates to give you a covariance which better matches your observed data. This framework is inspired by a variational autoencoder, where the inference network is referred to as a recognition network. Then on top of this, you have a prior, which is a recurrent neural network, which forecasts and regularizes your inference on your mixing coefficients. So a lot of the deep learning magic in this model comes from this inference network, where you've fixed the number of trainable parameters to the weights and biases of these networks. And this allows you to scale to large data sets very well. And this is a much more flexible Bayesian inference framework, which allows us to write down a more flexible generative model. And then we could also take advantage of modern deep learning Python libraries, which can make this efficient to train with using GPUs and modern hardware. So, okay, so we have this model, and we'd like to apply it, or let's see what description of resting state meg data this model gives. So again, we start off with our data, and then we train DyNeMo, and we see what the latent description, the mixing coefficients of this data are. And we see a very different description to the HMM, where all of the modes are active at any given time point. And what dynamically fluctuates is their contribution to the total covariance. So each of the colors represents a mode, which is a network. And then the width indicates how much is contributing to the instantaneous covariance at each time point. Comparing this to the HMM fitted on same data, we see this is a very complementary description of the data. However, if you did binarize these mode time courses, you could calculate the same summary statistics of dynamics that you would for the HMM, and we still see fast states or fast dynamics or fluctuations in this latent description. Okay, so now I'll just finish off by giving an example of how we can use these dynamic network models in a task paradigm and how this could be useful for interpreting your data. Okay, so we start off with some functional neuroimaging data recorded during a task. And in this particular task, it's a simple visual perception task where the participant was shown a face or a scrambled image. And a conventional approach in infers anyway is to do a time frequency response where you, for each parcel or sensor, you calculate either a wavelet or some form of time frequency decomposition, and then you look for the response or epoch around events, and you look for a response. This has a debilitating number of multiple comparisons and could reduce your statistical sensitivity. So a better approach might be, given that brain data has all these spatial temporal patterns, maybe get a compact representation using these dynamic networks and do your task analysis on these dynamic networks. This is exactly what Chiara did on the first talk. Okay, so first you start off, you go back to your data and you ignore the fact, or what's typical is you ignore the fact that this is task data, and you get your dynamic network description directly from the data. And if you train a HMM on this, you get a very typical description of these large-scale networks with very short durations, which have unique oscillatory properties. And then if you train DyNeMo on this data, this is the same data, you get a typical DyNeMo description, which is has much more localized functional networks which have unique oscillatory properties. And this description is overlapping in time. Okay, so now you have this compact representation of the dynamics of these networks. You can then impose the knowledge that you know that at certain time points, certain stimuli were presented to the participant. And you can epoch the state time course, so the time course of state activations around your events, and average that, and you get a network level response. You could do the same with DyNeMo, and comparing the two network responses, given that the HMM has this mutual exclusivity assumption, for a state to activate or a network to activate, another must deactivate. So you get quite a complicated description that may be more difficult to interpret, whereas the extra flexibility in DyNeMo allows you to model the interaction, in this case, to a visual stimuli as the interaction between the visual network and the frontal network. Also, so another useful aspect of this kind of description is the sequential nature. So it might help you understand a cognitive process as an activation of one network followed by an activation of another network. So, such as the description on the right is maybe a low-level visual response followed by a maybe higher order frontal response, which then feeds back to a suppression of the visual network. So in general, DyNeMo gives, in the task-based paradigm, a more parsimonious description of your data. So I'd like to summarize by, there are methods which are quite robust in a data-driven fashion to identify these dynamic networks. It can be applied to MEG, EEG, fMRI, any functional imaging. I've focused on networks, but this can also be used for single-channel analysis for burst detection. In MEG, we find very fast phase-locking networks. I've talked about a new generative model called DyNeMo, which incorporates some advances from deep learning and overcomes some limitations of the Hidden Markov Model. And in a task paradigm, this can give a useful description of the task. So this was a large body of work with a lot of people that have contributed, so I'd like to acknowledge them here. And finally, you're all thinking, this is great, how do I apply this to my data? We have a toolbox written in Python. There's also a toolbox paper link, got phones everywhere, oh God. So you could have a look there. And also, if you're interested to see these in action, there are a few posters which apply this to various modalities. Go check them out. And also, if you have an interesting data set or interesting task, you'd like some advice of what's the best way of applying this perspective, if it's going to be useful or not, you can feel free to reach out. If you see me around this conference, feel free to stop by. Yeah.
Thank you. I had one quick question for you, which was, you were comparing the Hidden Markov Model and the DyNeMo solutions when you showed those plots. And maybe the color coding was different, but to me it looked like they were very different from one another.
The description?
No, the
overlapping. Yeah, when you binarize the mode. Yeah, that's because when you have this overlapping description, you can have long-lived or multiple co-activations. Yeah, so it is
different models.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. One question that came up was, how do you find the optimum number of modes?
Yeah, classic. Oh, I'd also like to comment on the first question with the how do you find the optimum number of states. Mainly you're interested in what a downstream task, like are you looking for a biomarker, are you looking for something to do with this description? And the advice is, if that's robust, then that's probably good enough, because you have, it's just the brain data isn't generated by a Hidden Markov model or a DyNeMo model. It's just a description of the data. And if what you want to use it for is robust, that's good enough. So this question of how many modes, just use the number of modes which are useful for something downstream and show that you don't get something completely different if you applied a different number of modes or states later. Is a good approach to have. Okay.
Another question is, how different was the classification accuracy between HMM and DyNeMo? Did you compare those?
Pretty similar. Yeah, all right.
How do you address the vanishing exploding gradients problem? I guess it's kind of a variation on how hard was it to train the model?
So it's not difficult to train, and LSTM it's a recurrent neural network designed to avoid this vanishing gradient problem.
Okay.
And we also have layer normalization in between.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right.
Well, thanks everyone for sticking with us through this session. I hope it was interesting. I thought it was quite interesting myself, and we'll let you all go about the rest of your day. Thank you.